5 and 6 today. So this chapter 5 is a really good one. And it kind of asks the question, and this is a question that I guess is asked a lot. There's certain questions that rabbis get a lot, and one of them has to do with anti-Semitism. You know, why have Jews been constantly targeted for hatred, persecution? That's one. But perhaps a more positive question we get is how has the Jewish people achieved so much? If you think about it, I mean, we've all talked about, you know, we all know the common practice of looking at the Nobel Prize winners and saying, oh, look at what percentage are Jews. And, you know, that's remarkable. Look at history, some of history's most influential people, you know, for better or for worse. I mean, you know, there are many influential. You know, Albert Einstein was named the person of the millennium by Time in 2000, I think. So obviously one of the most influential people, you know, Freud and even Karl Marx, you know, these are very influential thinkers. So what is it about Judaism that, or the Jewish people that sparks this achievement? Now, that is a very difficult question to answer. It may not really be even a fair question. Part of the challenge is it genetic or is it cultural? Think about this for a second. This is very important because there's a big difference. Is it in the genes? Is there some sort of a genius gene that is part of the Jewish gene pool? I don't think there's much evidence for that. I mean, you might, there was a book written about 30 years ago called The Jewish Mystique that made this argument. And it said that, that the elites, every culture has elites, and the elites in Christian culture were priests, Catholic priests, and they didn't have kids. The elites in Jewish culture were rabbis and they had lots of kids. So in some ways, the select that genes were selected for intelligence and passed on. There's really no evidence for that argument. It's conjecture. Now, maybe there's an element of truth. I'm not throwing it out, but I'm saying, however, the cultural argument is that we have a system focused on education and learning that that pushes people to change the world, and that the world as it is not the world as it ought to be, and that is why Judaism has produced such great thinkers. Is we've always trying to progress forward, always trying to improve the world, and so that's part of the thinking, and that's where we get this story that is in this chapter about the palace in flames. And that is a very, very enigmatic story. But I see a couple of hands. I want to get into the story, but first, just unmute yourself if you have a question or comment.
Okay, I do, Rabbi. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hey, Sue.
Well, first of all, you said exactly what I was going to say. The Jews, for the most part, not completely, of course, but for the most part, have always put a huge premium on education. And educating our children and the people that come after us has always been very important. And one of the things about this chapter that really struck me, in fact, my daughter and son-in-law are out here with me in Arizona, and I read this sentence to them when I was reading the chapter because I think it sums it all up. And it's the last sentence of chapter 5, where it says, Judaism is the revolutionary moment at which humanity refuses to accept the world as it is. And I mean, I just think that sums it all up.
Yep. And that question is, the question is why? You know, what is the reason for that? And that's where Sachs says this story of the palace in flames kind of helps us at least understand those origins. That because underneath this midrash about the palace in flames is, what was it about Abraham that led God to choose Abraham to start this new religion? Because in the Torah, there's nothing, we don't learn any, there's no backstory to Abraham. God just sees somebody who's traveling and says, I'm going to reveal a new religion to you. There's no description as to why, nothing. And so the Midrash comes in to kind of fill in this backstory. And that's where this palace in flames comes in. And this is so this is a Midrash, just like we all know that story about that Abraham's father was an idol maker, and that one day he left the store and Abraham, took a club, smashed all the idols, and then put the club in the hands of the biggest idol. And when his father came home, his father was upset, and Abraham said, well, this is the most powerful idol, so it destroyed all the other idols. The point of that story being that idolatry doesn't make any sense. That's a midrash. And just like this palace in flames story is a midrash, and every midrash is meant to teach us a different angle, a different way of understanding. And so this midrash about the palace in flames is trying to teach us to understand why God would choose Abraham. And then as a larger picture, if we understand why God chose Abraham, then we understand what's unique about the Jewish people. So the midrash is a little bit difficult to understand. And the idea is that one day Abraham was just some average guy, and he was walking in the woods. And he's walking in the woods and he sees a castle. And the castle is on fire. That's sort of odd. And then he sees his castle on fire, and he says, well, why isn't anyone putting out the fire? You know what? Why is nobody doing anything about it? And and then he hears a voice from the fire, and it says, I am the owner, or a voice from the castle. It says, I am the owner of this castle. This is the exact story from the Midrash. The Lord said to Abram, leave your land, your birthplace, and your father's house. To what may this be compared? To a man who was traveling from place to place when he saw a palace in flames. He wondered, is it possible that the palace lacks an owner? The owner of the palace looked out and said, I am the owner of the palace. So Abraham, our father, said, is it possible that the world lacks a ruler? The Holy One, blessed be he, looked out and said to him, I am the ruler, the sovereign of the universe. Enigmatic, isn't it? And very enigmatic. And what Sachs says is that this story is actually all about, essentially about Tikkun Olam, and about there being a kind of cognitive dissonance to the world, that the world is built with a tension. The tension is the world has a creator. Somebody created this world, and yet the world is in flames. In other words, there are a lot of problems. The world as it is not as the world as it ought to be. If you would think that if an all-powerful ruler created the world, that it would be perfect. It would be utopian, right? Everything would be great. And yet we have a ruler, a God, and yet the world is in flames. In flames meaning a metaphor for there's lots of problems, wars, conflicts, tension, hunger, all the terrible things in the world. So Abraham says, why is this? What is this cognitive dissonance? And his whole life, essentially, or all of Judaism, is a response to it. To say there is a cognitive dissonance, and our job is to try to bring the world a little bit closer to what it should be. It doesn't wrap up tightly. It doesn't wrap up with an easy bow. Here's what Sachs writes. With this story, we arrive at the starting point of Jewish faith, perhaps still not fully understood. Faith is born not in the answer, but in the question, not in harmony, but in dissonance. If God created the world, then he created man. Why then does he allow man to destroy the world? How are we to reconcile the order of nature with the disorder of society? Can God have made the world only to abandon it? From time immemorial to the present, there have always been two ways of seeing the world. The first says there is no God, da 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 da, and that's the atheist. Everything's just conflicting forces. We can know how, but we can never know why, for there is no why. The world just stinks. This is, that this is the sort of this is a atheistic sense view of the world. This is just full of tension and conflict. Almost a polytheistic view of the world. The Greek view, there's lots of warring gods, and we're just right in the middle of it. The second view insists that there is a God. All that exists is because he made it. All that happens transpires because he willed it. Therefore, all injustice is an illusion. This is the second point of view. When the innocent suffer, it is to teach them faith through suffering, obedience through chastisement. Evil is the cloak that masks the good. There is a palace, in other words, but there are really no flames. That's a absolutist view of an omnipotent God, that everything happens for a reason and there really is no injustice in the world. It is what it is. The faith of Abraham, Sachs says, begins in the refusal to accept either answer, for both contain a truth, and between them there is a contradiction. The first accepts the reality of evil, the second the reality of God. The first says that if evil exists, God does not exist. The second says that if God exists, evil does not exist. But supposing both exist, supposing there are both the palace and the flames. In other words, God exists and evil exists, and human beings exist trying to resolve that tension. Pretty good, isn't it? Pretty good. Questions about that? It's a pretty different way of looking at religion. We often think of religion, I mean, even Marx said religion is an opiate for the masses. It gives people a way of reconciling themselves with the universe. That if bad things happen, it's the will of God, and it actually really is just good happening, hidden to make it look bad. And Sachs is saying actually Judaism is the opposite. It's not an opiate, it's a prod. It's a push to do more. And it's a beautiful way of understanding this midrash. This is a very, very powerful midrash. And in some ways, this has characterized Jewish history for a long time. Somebody once asked Shimon Peres, what is the essence of Judaism? And he said, dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction. Now, I don't know. I don't really like that answer so much. That's sort of it kind of says that we're never going to be happy, right? And that's not, I don't think that's the idea.
Rolling Stone said.
I don't think the idea is that we're never going to be happy. I think the more the idea is that the world as it is just not the world as it ought to be. That we shouldn't, that acceptance, pure acceptance, is not a way to live. Yes, there are certain things we have to accept. If you're 5'9", you're not going to play in the NBA. There are certain things you have to accept. You may not, unless you're, Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, or you're not going to be the richest person in the world. You're not going to be able to, you're not going to be able to do everything you want. There are certain things you have to accept in life. We all know that. But you can't accept everything as it is. The world can always be improved a little bit at a time. And this is what Abraham's original insight was, that's what Abraham conceived. Yeah, Mom and Dad?
I never.
Yeah. You know that saying, we should be a light unto the nation. I mean,
Yes.
I think that sort of summarizes it. But what I was going to ask you is, this story reminds me, it's like a precursor to the Moses story about seeing the burning bush.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you feel there's some connection there and kind of some advance when Moses sees the burning bush for what happens here.
Well, this is just midrash. So this
I know,
comes
yeah.
after the burning. So this story is probably written after the burning bush story. So this, but I think there are similarities because the way that I'm interpreting it and that Sachs is interpreting it is not the only way to interpret it. As Sachs even says, you could interpret this as a mystical story. You could say the palace is in flames and there is an owner and we don't know why. In that the world is a mystery and part of living is to accept and acknowledge that mystery. You could interpret this story that way too. This is just so in other ways, the idea of the burning bush, you could also interpret it as a mystical story that Moses sees this sight that cannot be explained and he has to live with an acknowledgement of that mystery. So yes, they're very similar stories. I think part of the story is part of the purpose of each story is to kind of acknowledge the mystery, acknowledge that it doesn't wrap up nicely, and so but there are different ways of interpreting it. That makes sense.
Could
For
be a
me,
hallucination.
Evan,
too.
Yeah, who's
for me,
next?
Evan, hey, Evan.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say it's the two stories, the burning bush and the palace, the miraculous thing, the miraculous nature of both of them is that the bush burns, but it's not consumed.
Yes.
Palace burns eternally, but is never consumed, right? It's kind of, it is the same in that sense. And that's what on page 58, kind of the end of what you were reading is this, he sums it up in a couple of lines when he says, God exists, therefore life has a purpose. Evil exists, therefore we have not yet achieved that purpose.
Right.
Until then, we must travel, right? It's just a great say. It's not the dissatisfaction that Perez is talking about. It's the action, right, that we have to take to to make stand.
Right. Exactly. And here's another part of it. You could ask the question, why doesn't God just put out the fire? Right? That is a perfectly good question. If God is the creator of the palace and God is all powerful, why doesn't God just, put out all the fire? Get an extinguisher, use the fire extinguisher, put it out. Sachs answers that question directly. Man sets fire to the palace, setting the world aflame. God can, but may not put out the fire, for if God does so, man is no longer free. A finite being is not free in a world in which an infinite power intervenes to prevent him from acting or facing the consequences of his action. In other words, if God decided to put out the fire, we would no longer have free will. We are free. This is why Maimonides said free will is a core principle of Judaism, that actions have consequences and so forth. So it's not, the fact that there's a fire is not a reflection of God. It's a reflection on human beings. Only human beings can put out the fire. However, human beings have guidance and partnership with God. That's the other part of this. God could put out the fire, but God does not, because God created human beings with free will. With that free will, we have guidance from God. It's almost like a parent, Okay. Other comments about this? Do we have any more hands? It's such a great story.
I'm Evan.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Could this have explained, we're always complaining about how God supposedly forgot about the Jews in Egypt. They were for 400 years, they were miserable and slaves and everything. Why didn't God stop their misery? It kind of reminds me of this, did it take, then it says, oh, God remembered the Jews in Egypt, and then it was called off, God intervened. it's somehow it's connecting chords in my head about the unhappiness of Egypt, and then finally God got involved in it.
Well, I think that the story of the Exodus, I think they're actually different stories, different theological responses. They're both rooted in the same problem. The same problem, the tension, is the issue of theodicy. Every theologian is responding to the question of theodicy, in that the ultimate question of theodicy is kind of, why do bad things happen to good people? That's the core question here. Why do the Israelites suffer unnecessarily? If God could free the Israelites from Egypt, why doesn't God do so? If God could put out the flames, why doesn't God do so? That's the question. And one answer, the one that Sachs seems to give, is that because if God were to be omnipotent and were to put out the flames, then human beings would not have free will. In the Exodus story, however, God does act to free the Israelites. God sends the plagues. God splits the sea. So it seems to be the opposite response in that story, the Exodus, than throughout most of history. If God could free the Israelites from Egypt with plagues and splitting the sea, why didn't God do anything during the Holocaust? That's a good question. That's a good question. There's no answer. There's no answer. I mean, you could give answers. One answer would be those were different eras in history. Another answer would be, the story of the Exodus is simply mythological, that there may have been the idea of God as an omnipotent being as part of our history, but we live in a world in which God does not act in such ways. Maybe a long, long, long time ago, in sort of the mythical realm of existence, God could split a sea and inflict plagues, but that's not the world in which we live in now. So, but the responses in these instances are different. In the Palace in Flames story, God doesn't do anything. God says, Abraham, you are in charge of doing something. In the Exodus story, though, God does act. So it's the same theological problem, but two different responses. And one response is the biblical response. The other is the rabbinic response. And we live in the rabbinic world. We live in the idea of tikkun olam. Whew, that's a lot. That's a lot of theology. Other comments here? Andy, go ahead.
Rabbi,
Yeah, go ahead.
could we argue that God did act when it came in the Holocaust? Maybe God just acted late, but the Jewish people were saved, the state of Israel was created. Is there an argument to make that there was some divine action, albeit late?
I think I think you could make it. I think it's a hard argument to make, though. I think that would be a difficult argument, because you could say, well, then why did 1.5 million, children die? You say, it would say, if God had the ability to act, I think that would make it more difficult for God. That would be my response. I mean, it's certainly a plausible response, but I think it would be a hard one to make. It would be kind of like
Evan,
saying,
I think
go ahead.
I think Emil Fackenheim's idea of the eclipse of God is perhaps the most valuable post-Shoah, understanding of this, right? That human beings light enough fires, create enough smoke, that it blocks God's ability to see and act, right? And there's not much to give us comfort when it comes to the Shoah, and why God could act at the time Israelite slaves and not at this time, right? And that's what Fackenheim tries to get at, I think, with this idea that human beings have the ability to put up so much flame, right, that it blocks God from being here.
Excellent. I think that's good. There's a larger issue here, and this is something that is very connected to theology, and that is the issue of unresolved tension. I was listening to a podcast this morning, actually, while I was swimming, and the podcast was talking a little bit about Marxism, and Marx's kind of influence from Hegel, the philosopher. And we all know about Hegel with the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? That you have the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and then the synthesis is a new thesis and the antithesis and synthesis. But what Hegel said is that every contradiction has to be resolved. There has to be, that the world, every contradiction needs some sort of response. Every thesis needs an antithesis, and then every thesis that comes out of it needs another antithesis. And Marx took the same idea that there has to be a proletariat and a revolution, and that there's this ongoing pattern of history. And I think actually Christianity, Hegel is of course influenced by Christianity. Christianity also says there has to be a resolution to that tension. There has to be resolution. And in Christianity, that resolution comes through Messiah, that Jesus rose and achieved salvation for all of humanity. I think one of the great gifts of Judaism is unresolved tension. That you don't have to get every answer. You know what? We live in a world of total contradiction, a paradox. And that's okay. We're not going to get every answer while we're here. So most ideological systems, most religions have some resolution of tension. In Marxism, it's the socialist utopia. In Christianity, it's salvation by Jesus. In Judaism, there's no resolution. I mean, there's a resolution way off, there's the messianic time, but there's no resolution. And I think Jewish culture actually preserved, even the Talmud, most of the arguments in the Talmud are left unresolved. Remember, there's like 5,000 debates in the Talmud, and there are only about 50 answers. So most debates are left unresolved. Now, isn't that interesting? We don't have to always come to an answer. We can live with a paradox. And what I think Fitzgerald, F. Scott Fitzgerald said, the test of a great mind is the ability to hold opposing ideas at once and still function. So sometimes you have to be able to hold opposing ideas at once and still go forward. And I think Judaism is brilliant at doing that. And I think Sachs kind of illustrates the same thing. Okay, comments. Andy, you had your hand up before and we missed you.
I think you've really expounded on it. I mean, I think it's a very terse, obvious thing. There are more questions than answers. And I think Judaism would say that. I don't know if other religions would. And a lot of the answers are you either take them or you don't. I mean, who knows what the afterlife is like? Who's been there and come back? So they say, we know someone who's Christian who said she would have to believe that she's born again and take that on because now she knows her body won't disintegrate. And how about these Christian militia? They've been told that Jesus wants them to love Trump. He's the second, and they're going to take that. But we don't seem to have that. I mean, maybe some do, but that need to have this answer because it's really phony. That's what I have.
Yeah, I think that's right. And even there are also ways you can accept an answer and yet live as if live even though the answer has not yet come true. Like there are plenty of modern Orthodox Jews. I know some of them, they are brilliant. There are plenty of modern Orthodox Jews who believe that there will be a third temple at some point. But they don't live as if the third temple is imminently coming and that we have to gather, so you can hold an idea in your head to say, ultimately God will rebuild a temple. Great. But right now I'm going to deal with the world as it is, and I'm going to live in this world. So there's a tension, but that's okay. It doesn't have to be resolved. So there are plenty of people who could say, yes, I believe I will be resurrected. But so what? You can believe that. Now, if it totally shapes one could believe that that God is coming to the world imminently. That there will be a second coming. You could believe that that's coming in, 50 years or 20 years. Now, you could believe that and still live a perfectly normal, good, productive life. Or you could be crazy and say, you know, there's an argument among Christian. I know you'll love this, Andy. There are Christian anti-environmentalists who say, well, if the second coming is coming in 20 years, then it really doesn't matter what we do with the environment. We can destroy it as need be. Now that's a minority. That's a small group. I don't want to mischaracterize Christianity by any means, but that could be one way of living in it. Or you could say to yourself, you know what? In 50 years, there's going to be a second coming, but I'm going to deal with the world as it is. The world as it is, there are environmental issues, and I'm going to live a responsible life. So it's perfectly possible to live with contradiction, but some people just don't, they can't. It's very hard. So I would say Judaism asks us to live with that contradiction. Yep, Sarah?
And I think that's a big intellectual strength of Jewish people, because the scientific method, nothing is ever really known. You have a hypothesis, you test the next thing. You always have unresolved tension of some of the data that doesn't quite fit. You know, what Einstein said is the scheme we have now doesn't fit, so I'm going to come up with something different. You know, Freud said there must be some unconscious things going on because medicine is not explaining what happens in mental illness. I think each of the great thinkers you talked about made a response to something that bothered them that was unresolved. And that dissatisfaction in the way things are is another key element that you mentioned. Like Salk said, we don't have to have polio. There must be something we can do about polio. And so he worked on that problem.
Yeah, there's always tension. When there's no tension, we're dead. That's it. I mean, just all of us have tension right now. If you want to stand up and walk out the door, there's tension, right? You have to stand up. You have to use energy to stand. You have to use energy to walk to the door. There's tension. And once there is no tension, there's no life. So, you know, how we deal with that tension now, some people have more tension than others. You know, you don't want terrible tension in your muscles, right? You want to take care of yourself. You know, you have to deal with that tension. But the ultimate tension is death, is having to die at some point, and living and suffering. Suffering is and so these are answers to that tension. And in Judaism, we're comfortable with paradox. That is so essential. Paradox. And we need to be able to live with that. Yeah. Evie, go. Evie, Lynn, then Jeff. Yeah, unmute. We have the tension of muting and unmuting. That is a core tension we have to resolve. Evie, you're muted. Can't hear you. You got it? It's okay. We can wait. Lynn, why don't you go ahead, and then Evie will come back to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm trying to get my thoughts together here. First of all, I think our history has a lot to do with the evolution of ideas and the liberalism within Judaism that provides for different ideas. And Sachs stresses the point that ideas are the key to reform. The idea of naturalism, that man has and determinism, that man has no control over his environment, that was a prevailing idea. But as that idea, as the age of reason came into being, and Sachs says this particularly on page 73, that God is not in nature, but is above nature. Yes. And that idea that nature is determining our fate, and that we are at the mercy of natural forces, and that we have no control, and God is indifferent to us, that Judaism has really, I believe, not accepted that concept, or has evolved out of that concept that there is a God who cares about us. There is a God who encourages free will, that believes that that man has control over his own future. So I think that idea will make Judaism, for its resilience and its ability to control our ability to control our own fate, is going to ensure our survival. And what, I don't know who it was, last week or the week before, all those scholars who said Jews are the only ones that we know who have persevered through time and eternity because they have been so resilient, and they have survived over obstacles. So if you think about our history, we have encountered time and time again threats to our survival. And each time we have overcome that survival. And you would say the Holocaust is an exception to that. But look, I mean, Jews have survived. I mean, they have survived, and their faith, I think, is partly responsible for that.
Yeah, I think, yeah, Linda, I'm glad you brought up the point about ideas. And in fact, chapter 6 may be among the most important chapters in this book, because he kind of says that how powerful ideas are. And this this couple of sentences, I think, is so true. This is on page 65 and 66. The whole of Judaism is about the attempt to live out certain ideas about humanity, freedom, responsibility, and society, ideas of which we as Jews may be unaware, just as we can buy a newspaper without knowing the economic, technological, and cultural processes that made it possible. But nonetheless, we are affected by them, for they move beneath the surface of Jewish life, like a vast and powerful ocean swell, lifting us up on its waves and drawing us into its motions. In other words, we are living within a context shaped by several powerful ideas. And I would say this is not just Jews, this is everybody in the Western world, and increasingly everyone on the entire globe, because the Western ideas have influenced everybody. And Jewish ideas have shaped the Western world. I mean, the founding ideas of America are really rooted in Judaism, are rooted in kind of the Hebrew Bible. So we are all living with these ideas. And the core idea, Sachs says, is the idea of progress. That, again, the world as it is not the world as it ought to be. And that is we say in the Declaration of Independence, these truths are self-evident. Well, that's a mistake, because they're not self-evident. If they were self-evident, then everyone would believe them. Not everyone believes them. It was a certain group in a certain time in a certain place that embraced these ideas. Okay, Evie, let's go back to you, then Jeff, then Alan and Carol.
Just two random thoughts. The one thought that keeps going through my mind, and has for a long time, is a belief could be changed in a day. You could have a very strong belief, something in your life or in the world happens, and you can do a 180-degree change on that. The other thing is, and it's kind of tangential to what you just said, which I have not read chapter 6. What do we know? How do we know that God? What don't we know? God may have intervened many times, but we don't know because it hasn't happened. Or we're not aware that it happened.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, there's so much we're not aware of. I think that's one of those questions that we can never answer. But about beliefs and changing beliefs, I think you're right. But there are also a lot of times people don't change their beliefs. I mean,
right. But
yeah, most people, again, this is sort of, if you're a rational person, then you can change, the evidence changes and your opinion changes. Most people are not rational. Most people, they could see, I mean, just look at politics. People stick by ideas that clearly haven't worked, and they stay committed to them, even though in every instance they don't work. In some ways, beliefs are powerful because they defy reason sometimes. So, the scientific method would say, yeah, the evidence changes, we change. But that doesn't always shape how we act. Okay, Jeff, then Alan.
What I was going to say, we've kind of moved on in the discussion, but in just thinking about contradictions and cognitive dissonance, I really believe the challenge is accepting the magnitude of that cognitive dissonance. And what I mean by that is, it's one thing trying to get up, staying seated. And I'm not trying to make a silly
Right.
example, but that's one thing.
Right.
And then you've got the Holocaust, which, is obviously very troubling for many of us. And so I think the point I want to make is it's easier to accept the contradictions for certain things that are maybe not quite that important, but when we get to something really big, like what we've discussed, it's just more of a challenge.
Oh, for sure. For sure. The other thing though is people can respond to contradictions in totally opposite ways. So I've known people who they see what happened during the Holocaust and they say, how could I ever believe in God? How could I ever step foot in a synagogue with knowing what happened during the Holocaust? I could never, ever believe in God after that. And then someone could say, how could I ever not believe in God when I saw what human beings can do to one another? How could I ever not have faith and hope and a vision of a better world given what happened between people? We can respond to contradictions with totally the opposite way. Now, why do we respond in the way that we do? Well, that's a bigger question. That's psychological, that's cultural, that's all kinds of different factors. But the existence of a contradiction does not always tell us how we should respond to that contradiction. Yeah,
Right.
Alan, Carol?
But I have a concern that arises out of my reading of chapter 6.
Yeah, good.
Sachs points out that the great breakthrough in ideas that Judaism made was the idea of a single God. But he points out that Islam and Christianity adopted that same idea. How then does he jump to the conclusion that Judaism is still unique? It's as if he's placing Judaism above these other religions which believe in monotheism.
Okay, that's a big question.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I would think, first of all, there really isn't much evidence for that. That is really his belief that Judaism discovered the idea of one God. That's sort of, most scholars would say that that's really not the case, that it was an evolution within Judaism, I mean, even in the Mi Chamocha, it says, Mi Chamocha ba'elim Adonai, who is like you, O God, among all the gods that are worshipped. So even early Judaism, biblical Judaism, still has the idea of multiple gods. So, and even some of the Psalms hint at the existence of a sea god. So first of all, I would say scholars would question his assertion, even though most of us probably grew up believing that Judaism discovered monotheism. Now, be that as it may, whoever discovered monotheism doesn't really matter, right? We exist. So then, what then makes Judaism unique if Christianity and Islam are also monotheistic? Well, Sachs would say a couple of things. I think part of him would say Judaism is superior because we have the system of mitzvot, and that these mitzvot are the highest path to serving that one God, to enacting the will of that God in the universe. That's part of Sachs. Let's call that the ultra-Orthodox part of Sachs. The other part of Sachs would say nothing makes Judaism superior. It's just our language. Just like we speak English, other people speak French, other people speak Spanish. One language isn't superior to one another, but English is our means of communication. Spanish is another group's means of communication. So the mitzvot, Judaism, Jewish law, that's our means of serving God. Just like Christianity is another group's means of serving God. So that would be the other part of Sachs, that it isn't necessarily superiority. It is simply our language, the way that we speak. But he would also say that it's kind of like Judaism is the foundation. You know, without Judaism, those other monotheisms would not really exist. That's another way of understanding it. That's complicated though. Who else had their hands up in questions? This is good stuff. All right, let's keep going. So ideas are extremely powerful. And he talks about myth, and he talks about how this myth that in other religions, sort of a Greek mythology, that really power rested on strength, and that this is on page 68. Myth had a particular view of mankind, one that has held the human imagination captive. Reality is power, and power is the collective. Only when individuals form societies can they defeat the forces around them. And only when the many are subjugated to the few can societies exist. In ancient myth and ritual, kings are or aspire to be gods. The rest of humanity in its various gradations is replaceable. They are worker ants serving the queen, or beasts of burden serving the master, a labor force, an army, the means to an end. I mean, this describes totalitarian societies, right? That, you know, there's a reason that, like in China, for example, you know, highways and railroad centers can be built very quickly because there's a power that says, you do this, this is your job. Whereas in the United States, it can take years to get something done because there are a lot of competing interests. And essentially, you know, that's a broader description of the difference between a totalitarian culture, a culture that is built upon power, versus a culture that is built upon on the individual, and that every human being is created in the image of God. And that it would seem that the laws of nature would favor power. But actually within Judaism, and then Sachs goes on, against this backdrop, a sentence was uttered that heralded the greatest paradigm shift in the story of mankind. Quote, so God made man. He uses all this masculine language. That's just God. So God made man in his own image. In the image of God, God created him. Male and female, he created them. This single proposition was an explosive charge at the base of the entire structure of the ancient and medieval world. So essentially, the kings, rulers, emperors, pharaohs were the image of God, but now the people are also the image of God. So basically what Sachs is saying here is that Judaism introduced this idea of humanity, that it had always, the self-evident idea was that certain people were created in the image of God, kings and the powerful. But then within Judaism, we introduced the idea that every human being is created in the image of God. And that proposition is responsible for everything that we know in the world today. The idea of human rights, the idea of democracy, the idea of kind of fairness and equality, that is all rooted in this idea. And whereas the Declaration of Independence said these ideas are self-evident, Sachs would say they are not self-evident. In fact, the opposite is self-evident. Really, the opposite is, if you go into a forest, the animals are not equal. You know, there is the king of the jungle, as they say. You know, that the more self-evident idea is that the powerful are the ones who are deserving of more of the resources. So this is not self-evident. Let's see. Okay, let's keep going here. Okay, he quotes Lionel Trilling. He's talking about the shift in consciousness and the birth of the modern. I mean, this is this is great. So he's sort of he's kind of criticizing the secular worldview. He says, there is a way of summarizing the history of the West in 3 sentences. In the beginning, people believed in many gods. Monotheism came and reduced them to one. Science came and reduced them to none. Not really true. And he basically says, he kind of critiques this idea of science. He essentially says that science, and he's right in this, science is morally neutral. It's very, I mean, think about it. think about the Holocaust and the scientific experiments that went on during the Holocaust, that you know, that people were tortured in order to come through. Who was there? There was a famous, there were studies that were done during the Holocaust that were actually very helpful. I don't forget what it was, something with eyes in treating some major condition, but they were based on these studies done at concentration camps. And then there was a lot of controversy over whether to use those studies or not. I forget what it was. I just remember reading about it. But the idea is that you can be perfectly amoral and have successful scientific breakthroughs, but that doesn't create the kind of society in which every human being is created in the image of God. This raises all kinds of interesting questions. What kind of society do we want to live in? What kind of society? And this obviously in an age of COVID is very important. Do we want to live in a perfectly efficient society where we use science to do everything, where artificial intelligence accomplishes that everything is the most efficient it can be, you know, that robots deliver goods to us, that all our trucks are driven by robots or automatically self-driving, you know, or do we want to live in some sort of society where there's human dignity? I mean, these are big, big questions. And Sachs would say that science can answer a lot of questions for us, but there is an entire moral realm as well. And that moral realm is based on human dignity. And that's really what this idea, this core idea of human dignity. And by the way, that idea, again, I've said this several times already today, it's not self-evident. Not every culture is built around that idea. The whole story of the Tower of Babel is kind of the midrash on Babel is that, you know, the people of the world were building a tower to go into the heavens, and that the most valuable part of that of building that tower were bricks, because bricks were expensive to create. So if a person fell from, if they had a big line of people, a human ladder, and a person would fall off that ladder, no big deal. A person is replaceable. But if a brick fell off that ladder, if they were patching up a brick and somebody dropped it, oh my God, we lost a brick. So people are cogs in a machine from that point of view. And there are plenty of cultures where people, individuals, are cogs in a machine. But within Judaism, we introduce this idea that we're not, that every human being is created b'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. And that's this core idea. Questions, comments, Andy?
If that is really the case, I mean, I thought it was, would there be, I mean, how would Jews own slaves in this country? I mean, they were slaveholders. That means did they follow the rationale that the slaves weren't human?
Well, I mean, first of all, not all Jews follow Judaism, right? You know, so you know, we are human beings like everybody else, and so nobody's perfect. So you could say that there are, you know, you could be Jews but not acting in a Jewish way. So that's one thing. And the other idea is that, you know, even in the Hebrew Bible itself, there's slavery. Part of it is we are never perfect. We never fully realize these ideals. Never. You know, they're ideals towards which we are striving, but we are not there yet. Again, that's the paradox. Once again, we get to a paradox. You know, how could, I mean, you just described a paradox. How could Jews ever own slaves? Well, because on the one hand, every human being is created in the image of God and deserving of inherent dignity. But on the other hand, at a certain period of time, owning slaves is very profitable. So there's this contradiction. And we're trying to constantly move towards the ideal, but we're never there. You know, human beings are imperfect. Human beings are imperfect. Yeah. Any other comments? Questions? I think the thing to take away from this is ideas. And I think many of us, we take for granted a lot of the basic assumptions of Judaism. because many of those basic assumptions are built into the Western world. But that's why Sachs titled, the original title of this book was Radical Then, Radical Now, that these ideas are actually quite radical. And most of us don't live out these ideas. And sometimes we need to review what made Judaism so unique in order to live by it. Okay, I'll see everyone on next Monday, and have a great week.
Yes, sir, Koch.
Thanks.
Just let me say we are making luminaries from 3:30 to 4:30. So if you'd like to come light a luminary for Martin Luther King and light up the parking lot with us, come join us at 3:30.
We also have tonight Richard Rothstein on The Color of Law, a forgotten history of how our government segregated America. So if you go to your Macomb at home, you can still sign up for that lecture and discussion tonight in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King.
Thank you.
Rabbis.
Okay, goodbye,
Thank
everybody.
you, rabbis.
Thank you.
Stay well.